The meeting chamber materialized around them as the Crown Archive responded to their need for a neutral space. Empress Cathara stood across from Marcus, her ancient features showing an expression he had never seen on a Valthari face before. Uncertainty mixed with wonder, and the rigid patterns that had marked her skin for centuries now flowed with colors that spoke of deep contemplation. "Show me," she said simply. "Show me what we have missed in our pursuit of dominance." Marcus placed his hand on a smaller version of the crown of stars that had appeared between them. The crystal responded instantly, projecting a three-dimensional history that filled the chamber with light and movement. They watched civilizations rise and flourish through cooperation, species that had seemed incompatible finding ways to complement each other's strengths. The Zephyrians were master engineers but lacked creativity, Marcus narrated as the images flowed around them. The Kelthani were brilliant artists but struggled with practical applications. When they worked together, they built cities that were both functional masterpieces and works of incredible beauty. Princess Zarathis stood beside her mother, her own patterns bright with excitement. "Look at the medical advances, Mother. The predecessor archives show that every breakthrough came from combining different approaches to healing. No single species had all the answers." The Empress watched in silence as more examples played out before them. Agricultural worlds that fed entire sectors through shared knowledge. Peaceful resolutions to conflicts that should have led to devastating wars. Technologies that grew, stronger and more elegant when developed by multiple species working in harmony. "But what about security?" the Empress asked finally. "What about the natural order of strong civilizations guiding weaker ones?" The projection changed, showing the darker chapters of galactic history. Marcus felt the Crown's knowledge flowing through him as he witnessed the price of the philosophy the Empress had lived by her entire life. "Strength without wisdom leads to collapse," he said gently. The Haraki Empire conquered 40 systems before they realized their rigid hierarchy had eliminated all innovation. They couldn't adapt when the environment changed, and their entire civilization fell within a single generation. The predecessors documented hundreds of similar cases. "And the Threnodi Collective," Princess Zarathis added, her voice heavy with newfound understanding. "They were the most powerful military force in their region for 3,000 years. But when they faced a challenge that couldn't be solved through force, they had no idea how to change. They died out not from war, but from their inability to grow." The Empress stared at the projections for a long time, her skin patterns cycling through colors Marcus had never seen before. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries of certainty crumbling away. "We have been so afraid of losing our position that we forgot why we sought it in the first place," she said. "We wanted to bring order to the galaxy, to prevent the chaos that destroyed so many civilizations before us. But in trying to control everything, we stopped learning from anyone." Marcus felt a warm pulse from the necklace and knew this was the moment the predecessors had planned for. Not conquest or submission, but understanding and voluntary change. He activated another function of the crown, showing the Empress something that made her gasp with amazement. "This is what's possible when species work together," he said, as the projection revealed technologies beyond anything the current galaxy had achieved. Cities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Starships that could travel between galaxies in days rather than millennia. Medical techniques that could extend life indefinitely while maintaining perfect health. The predecessors achieved all of this because they never tried to dominate the species they encountered, Princess Zarathis realized. They invited cooperation, shared their knowledge freely, and learned from everyone they met. And when they transcended physical form, they left everything behind for us to discover together, Marcus concluded. Not as a reward for conquest, but as a gift to those who could prove they understood the value of cooperation. The Empress stood in silence for several minutes, processing revelations that challenged everything she had built her reign upon. Finally, she turned to Marcus with an expression of profound respect. "Captain Chen, I owe your species an apology. We saw you as a threat to our way of life, but you were actually offering us a chance to improve it." She paused, her pattern settling into colors that Marcus recognized as deep sincerity. What would you have us do? Work with us, Marcus said simply. Share your organizational skills and long perspective with the galaxy. Help coordinate the awakening of predecessor facilities across hundreds of worlds. Use your influence to encourage cooperation rather than demanding submission. And in return, Marcus smiled. You get to be part of the greatest adventure any civilization has ever undertaken. The predecessors left us more than just technology and knowledge. They left us a path to transcendence, but only if we walk it together. The crown of stars pulsed, brighter, and suddenly the chamber filled with voices, not sounds but direct communication from beings across the galaxy who had proven capable of interfacing with predecessor technology. Humans from Earth were excited about ancient facilities they had discovered on the Moon and Mars. Representatives from the crystalline hegemony spoke of archives that had awakened in their core worlds. Even species the Vialthari had considered primitive were revealing sophisticated understanding of concepts that had remained hidden for millennia. There are so many of us, the Empress whispered in amazement. How did we never realize that capability was so widespread? Because you were only looking for reflections of yourselves, Princess Zarathis said gently. The predecessors designed their tests to find diversity, not similarity. Species that thought differently, approached problems from unique angles, brought perspectives that no one else could offer. Marcus felt the crown responding to the growing network of connections spanning the galaxy. Ancient facilities were sharing their knowledge, creating a web of communication and cooperation that grew stronger with each new participant. But more importantly, species that had been enemies for generations were beginning to see possibilities for working together. Through the quantum link, Marcus experienced the moment when human scientists collaborated with Valthari engineers to solve a power distribution problem that had puzzled both species for decades. He felt the joy of Kelthani artists working with Zephyrian builders to create structures that were both beautiful and perfectly functional. He witnessed former enemies becoming partners, then friends, then family. This is what the predecessors saw in us, he realized aloud. Not our individual achievements, but our potential to become something greater together. The Empress stepped forward and, in a gesture that would be remembered throughout galactic history, knelt before Marcus. Captain Chen, I formally request that Earth join the Valthari Empire not as a conquered world, but as an equal partner in building something new. Marcus felt the weight of the moment, knowing that his answer would shape the future of countless civilizations. The necklace pulsed warmly against his chest, and he could sense the approval of the ancient beings who had prepared this path. Your Majesty, I accept on behalf of humanity, but not just as partners with the Valthari Empire, as founding members of something the predecessors would have been proud to see. A galactic cooperative where every species contributes according to their strengths and benefits according to their needs. The crown of stars blazed with light so brilliant it was visible across the entire star system. Throughout the galaxy, predecessor facilities responded by fully awakening, sharing their complete knowledge with any being capable of learning from it. The age of hoarding secrets was ending, replaced by an era of shared discovery and mutual growth. Princess Zarathis looked between Marcus and her mother, with tears of joy streaming down her face. The necklace isn't glowing because you're special, Captain Chen. It's glowing because you represent hope. Hope that we can be better than we were, that we can grow beyond our fears and limitations. Marcus nodded, understanding finally complete. The necklace had never been about him alone. It had been about what he represented, the possibility that different species could work together, learn from each other, and achieve things none of them could accomplish alone. As the fleets surrounding the Crown Archive began working together instead of facing off for battle, Marcus felt a deep satisfaction. The test was over, and they had passed not through strength or cunning, but through the simple recognition that cooperation was always stronger than conquest. The predecessors had left them the tools to transform the galaxy. Now it was up to all of them to use those tools wisely, building a future where diversity was celebrated, knowledge was shared, and every species had the chance to contribute to something magnificent. The necklace pulsed one final time, its light spreading to touch every being in the chamber, and Marcus knew that this was only the beginning of humanity's greatest adventure. The private gardens of Princess Lyrelei were unlike anything Marcus had ever imagined. As they walked through the crystal archway that led from the throne room, he found himself in a world where biology and physics seemed to follow completely different rules. Trees made of living metal swayed in breezes that carried no sound. Flowers that looked like they were carved from precious gems opened and closed in response to the princess's presence. Streams of liquid light flowed through, channels cut into the ground, providing illumination that cast no shadows. But what caught Marcus's attention immediately was how everything in the garden reacted to Princess Lyrelei. As she moved along the crystalline pathways, the beautiful flora began to change. Flowers that had been blooming moments before started to close their petals. The metal trees stopped their gentle swaying and became rigid. Even the grass beneath her feet seemed to dim, as if her very presence was draining the life from everything around her. "This always happens," Princess Lyrelei said quietly, noticing Marcus's observation. Her telepathic voice in his mind was softer now, less formal than it had been in the throne room. "Everything living responds to my psychic field. They cannot help but submit, even the plants." Marcus knelt beside a cluster of crystal flowers that were slowly wilting as the princess approached. Each bloom was perfectly formed, like something a master artist might spend years creating, but they were dying simply because she was near. He pulled out his scanner again and began taking readings. "The electromagnetic interference is incredible," he said, more to himself than to her. "Your bioelectric field is interacting with their nervous systems. But look at this one." He pointed to a small flower at the edge of the cluster. While its companions were closing and dimming, this single bloom remained bright and open. Marcus moved his scanner closer, studying the readings with growing excitement. "This one is different. Its neural pathways are adapting, developing resistance to your psychic influence. It's fascinating. Your people's evolution forced other species to evolve in response." Princess Lyrelei moved closer to examine the flower he was studying. As she approached, even this resistant bloom began to show signs of stress, but it fought against the influence, its petals trembling but staying open. "I have walked through these gardens for 300 years, she said, her mental voice filled with something that might have been wonder. "Never once has anyone pointed out that some plants might be developing resistance. Everyone who has ever accompanied me here has been too afraid to notice such details." Marcus stood and brushed the crystal dust from his hands. "Fear makes people miss the most interesting parts," he said simply. "When you're worried about survival, you don't have time to notice the amazing things happening around you." They continued walking deeper into the gardens. The princess watched Marcus carefully as they moved, fascinated by his complete lack of fear. Every few steps, he would stop to examine something new. A vine that grew in perfect mathematical spirals. A tree whose leaves changed color in response to the light from her skin. A small pond where the water itself seemed to be alive, rippling in patterns that followed no natural law. "Your species must be very different from the others," Princess Lyrelei said as Marcus knelt to study the living water. "Every being I have ever encountered shows the same response to my presence: fear, submission, or the desire to flee. Even my own people find it difficult to be near me for extended periods." Marcus looked up from the pond where the water was forming impossible shapes in response to the princess's psychic energy. "Different how?" he asked. "You do not seem affected by my abilities at all. Your heart rate is elevated, but not from fear. Your brain patterns show curiosity and excitement rather than the usual terror or forced compliance. It is as if my psychic influence simply does not work on you." Marcus considered this as he watched a school of fish made of pure light swimming through the living water. "Maybe it's because humans develop differently," he said. "We never had strong psychic abilities, so we had to learn to work together in other ways. We developed empathy instead of dominance, cooperation instead of control. Maybe that made us naturally resistant to psychic influence." As they walked, Princess Lyrelei began to test this theory. She gradually increased the intensity of her psychic field, pushing her abilities harder than she had in decades. The garden responded immediately. The metal trees began to bend away from her. Crystalline flowers shattered under the psychic pressure. Small creatures that had been hidden among the plants fled in panic, but Marcus continued walking beside her, still asking questions about the various plants and asking if she was feeling well, because her bioluminescent pattern suggested she was straining herself. "You truly cannot feel it," she said in amazement. "I am projecting enough psychic energy to incapacitate 100 beings, and you are worried that I might be tired." "Are you?" Marcus asked with genuine concern. "Those light patterns under your skin are pulsing much faster now, and your breathing has changed. If you're pushing yourself to demonstrate something for my benefit, you don't need to. I believe you about your abilities." Princess Lyrelei stopped walking and stared at him. In all her centuries of life, no one had ever expressed concern for her well-being while she was displaying her power. People begged for mercy, offered tribute, or ran in terror, but never once had anyone asked if she was feeling tired. She allowed her psychic field to return to its normal levels, and the garden began to slowly recover around them. The metal trees resumed their gentle swaying. Some of the crystal flowers cautiously began to reopen their petals. "Why are you here?" she asked suddenly. "What does humanity want from the Zephyrian Empire?" Marcus sat down on a bench carved from a single large crystal, apparently unconcerned about the informality of the gesture in the presence of royalty. "Honestly, we're just curious. Humans have only been traveling between stars for about 200 years. We're still trying to understand our place in the galaxy. When we learned about your people, we wanted to meet you and see if we could be friends." "Friends," she repeated the word as if it were foreign to her. "I am not certain I understand this concept as you mean it. People who enjoy spending time together," Marcus explained, "who help each other, share experiences, learn from each other. People who care about each other's well-being without expecting anything in return." Princess Lyrelei sat down beside him on the crystal bench, her movements graceful and careful. Even this simple action caused some of the nearby plants to droop slightly, but Marcus didn't seem to notice or care. "Such relationships are impossible for my people," she said quietly. "Our psychic abilities make every interaction a matter of dominance and submission. I cannot have a conversation without the other person's mind being overwhelmed by my presence. I cannot touch another being without causing them pain. I have been alone for so long that I had forgotten there might be another way to exist." Marcus looked at her with the same curiosity and genuine interest he had shown everything else in the garden. "That sounds incredibly lonely," he said. The simple acknowledgement of her isolation, spoken without fear or pity, caused the bioluminescent patterns under her skin to shift into colors her advisors had never seen. Colors that spoke of hope, of connection, of possibilities that had been closed off for so long they had been forgotten. "It has been," she admitted, "very lonely." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the garden slowly come back to life around them. For Princess Lyrelei, it was the first peaceful moment she had experienced in decades. For Marcus, it was another fascinating glimpse into a completely alien way of life. The moment was interrupted by an urgent chiming sound from Marcus's communication device. He pulled it out and frowned at the display. "I'm sorry," he said. "My ship is detecting some kind of disturbance in the outer system, multiple unknown vessels approaching at high speed." Princess Lyrelei's expression immediately became serious. Her skin began to glow brighter as her psychic senses reached out beyond the planet's atmosphere. When she spoke again, her telepathic voice was filled with alarm. "Those are not unknown vessels," she said. "They are ships of Prince Vexthar, my cousin and rival for the throne. He has returned from the outer territories with a fleet, and he is not coming for a peaceful visit." She stood quickly, her mind already racing through the political implications. "He will challenge my right to rule. In our culture, such challenges must be answered immediately or be considered an admission of weakness." Marcus stood as well, his human instincts telling him that their peaceful moment in the garden was about to end abruptly. "What kind of challenge?" Princess Lyrelei's bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that spoke of ancient traditions and deadly consequences. "A test of dominance. Each claimant must demonstrate their psychic power by forcing the strongest-willed beings they can find into complete submission. It is how our people have chosen rulers for millennia. She looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed hope with deep concern. And I believe I may need your help, even though asking a human to participate in such a trial could mean death for both of us, if my theory about your resistance is wrong. In the distance, the sound of approaching ships began to echo across the arena of Dominion was a massive structure built into the side of a crystal mountain. As Marcus followed Princess Lyrelei through its ancient corridors, he could feel the weight of thousands of years of history pressing down around them. The walls were covered with carved records of past challenges, each one telling the story of Zephyrian rulers who had proven their right to lead through demonstrations of overwhelming psychic power. This arena has seen the rise and fall of 17 dynasties, Princess Lyrelei explained as they walked toward the central chamber. Her bioluminescent patterns were shifting rapidly, displaying complex combinations of colors that Marcus was beginning to recognize as signs of stress and determination. Every challenge for the throne has been decided here, according to laws that are older than most civilizations in the galaxy. The main arena was a circular chamber with thousands of seats carved into the crystal walls. Already, beings from across the Empire had gathered to witness the challenge. Marcus could see Zephyrian nobles in their flowing robes, their skin glowing with subdued light patterns. There were also representatives from vassal species, all of them keeping careful distance from the arena floor where the actual contest would take place. At the center of the arena stood Prince Vexthar, and Marcus understood immediately why this. Zephyrian was considered a threat to Princess Lyrelei's rule. He was tall and powerfully built, with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed with aggressive energy. His psychic presence was so strong that even the crystal floor beneath his feet was beginning to crack under the pressure. Beside him stood a collection of beings that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. There was a Chronari warrior, one of the few species in the galaxy known for their natural resistance to telepathic influence. The creature stood nearly 3 meters tall, covered in thick armor-like skin, but even it was trembling slightly in the presence of Prince Vexthar's power. Next to the Chronari was a representative of the Nexus Collective, its cybernetic implants designed specifically to resist mental manipulation. Even a hive mind representative was there, its multiple bodies standing in perfect formation despite the obvious strain they were experiencing. These are the strongest-willed beings Prince Vexthar could find in the outer territories, Princess Lyrelei said quietly. Each one is famous across the galaxy for their mental resistance. If he can force them all into submission, his claim to the throne will be considered legitimate by our ancient laws. Prince Vexithar's voice boomed across the arena, amplified by his telepathic abilities so that every being present could hear him clearly. I challenge the rule of Princess Lyrelei, he declared. I claim that she has grown weak through isolation and is no longer fit to lead our people. I call upon the ancient rites to prove my superiority. The crowd fell silent as Princess Lyrelei stepped onto the arena floor. The contrast between the two royal cousins was immediately obvious, where Prince Vexthar projected raw, aggressive power. Princess Lyrelei moved with a grace that spoke of centuries of absolute control. Her bioluminescent patterns were calmer now, displaying the deep blues and purples that indicated royal authority. I accept your challenge, cousin, she replied, her telepathic voice carrying easily to every corner of the arena. Let the ancient tests begin. Prince Vexithar smiled confidently and turned to face his collection of resistant subjects. One by one, he focused his psychic power on them, and one by one, they fell to their knees. The Chronari warrior, famous for fighting off telepathic predators on its homeworld, lasted less than 30 seconds before collapsing in complete submission. The cybernetically enhanced Nexus representative's implants sparked and failed as Prince Vexthar's power overwhelmed its artificial defenses. Even the hive mind, with its distributed consciousness across multiple bodies, found itself forced into a state of total obedience. The crowd roared its approval as Prince Vexthar stood triumphant over his defeated subjects. His bioluminescent patterns blazed with victory, creating light so intense that many of the spectators had to shield their eyes. Now it is your turn, cousin, He called to Princess Lyrelei. "Show us your subjects, and prove that you are still worthy to rule." Princess Lyrelei walked calmly to the center of the arena. The assembled crowd waited expectantly for her to reveal her own collection of resistant beings. Instead, she turned and looked directly at Marcus, who was standing in the royal viewing section. "I call upon Captain Marcus Chen of Earth to serve as my test subject," she announced. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps and shouts of disbelief echoed throughout the arena. Many of the Zephyrian nobles began speaking rapidly among themselves, their bioluminescent patterns flashing with shock and confusion. Even Prince Vexthar looked stunned by his cousin's choice. "You cannot be serious," he said, his telepathic voice carrying a note of genuine bewilderment. "A human? A species that has barely learned to travel between stars? This is either madness or an admission of defeat." Marcus felt every eye in the arena turn toward him. He could hear the whispers and see the gestures as thousands of beings discussed this unprecedented development. In all the recorded history of Zephyrian succession challenges, no royal had ever chosen such an apparently weak subject for their demonstration of power. But Marcus also saw something else. Princess Lyrelei was looking at him with an expression that mixed hope with desperation. She was gambling everything on her theory about human resistance to psychic influence, and if she was wrong, it would mean not just the end of her rule, but quite possibly both of their lives. Marcus walked down to the arena floor, ignoring the increasing volume of shocked conversation around him. As he approached Princess Lyrelei, he could see the doubt beginning to creep into her bioluminescent patterns, despite her outward calm. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "No," she admitted, "but I believe in what I observed in the gardens. You are different from every other species I have encountered. If I am right, you may be the key to proving that true strength comes from connection rather than dominance." Prince Vexithar laughed loudly, the sound echoing off the crystal walls. "This is pathetic, cousin. You stake your claim to the throne on a primitive human who probably does not even understand what is happening. When you fail to dominate this weak creature, your exile will be justified and permanent." Princess Lyrelei ignored her cousin's taunts and turned to face Marcus. Around them, the arena fell completely silent. This was the moment that would determine the future of the Zephyrian Empire. She began to gather her power, and Marcus could see the change immediately. The bioluminescent patterns under her skin became brighter and more complex. The air around her began to shimmer with psychic energy. The crystal floor beneath their feet started to vibrate with the force of her mental projection. Even the walls of the arena began to resonate with a low musical humming. The power she was channeling was incredible. Marcus could see cracks appearing in the crystal floor around them. Some of the weaker spectators in the crowd began to lose consciousness just from the residual effects of her psychic field. The very air seemed to become thick and heavy with telepathic force. But Marcus just stood there watching her with the same curious interest he had shown throughout their time together. As her power reached its peak, enough psychic energy to shatter mountains or drive entire populations to madness, he tilted his head slightly and asked, "Are you feeling all right? Your breathing seems strained, and those light patterns suggest you're pushing yourself harder than is probably healthy." The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single being in the arena moved or spoke. Prince Vexthar's confident expression had vanished, replaced by something that looked very much like fear. The assembled crowd stared in stunned disbelief at the human who was showing concern for Princess Lyrelei's well-being, while she was directing enough psychic force at him to level a city. Princess Lyrelei slowly allowed her power to return to normal levels, a smile spreading across her luminous features. The bioluminescent patterns under her skin shifted to colors that had not been seen in the arena for over 1,000 years. Colors that spoke of joy, of vindication, of possibilities that had been thought impossible. "The demonstration is complete," she announced to the crowd. "I have proven my power through the complete immunity of my chosen subject. Let any who doubt my fitness to rule consider what it means that the humans are unaffected by our greatest abilities." Prince Vexthar stepped forward, his own bioluminescent patterns now showing confusion and growing concern. "This proves nothing," he protested, The human is simply too primitive to understand what was happening to him. Then test him yourself, Princess Lyrelai challenged. If human immunity is simply ignorance, surely your power can overcome it. Prince Vexithar turned his full attention to Marcus, channeling all of his considerable psychic abilities toward the human. His power struck like a telepathic hurricane, enough mental force to drive most beings permanently insane. Marcus continued, to stand calmly in the center of the arena, apparently unaffected. After a few moments, he pulled out his scanner and began taking readings of the psychic energy swirling around him. Fascinating, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. The frequency patterns are completely different from Princess Lai. The archive was the deepest part of the royal palace, carved into the living rock of the planet itself. Princess Lyrelai led Marcus through corridors that had not been walked by outsiders for thousands of years. The walls were covered with crystalline memory banks that glowed softly with stored information, each one containing centuries of Zephyrian history. After what happened in the arena, my advisors are demanding answers, Princess Lyrelai explained, as they descended deeper into the mountain. They want to know why I was so confident that you would be immune to our psychic abilities. The truth is something that only the royal family has known for millennia. Marcus followed her through a massive door made of black crystal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Beyond the door was a chamber unlike anything he had seen before. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, and the walls were covered with holographic displays showing star maps, genetic charts, and historical records. At the center of the room stood a device that looked like a tree made of pure energy, its branches reaching up toward the unseen ceiling. This is the memory tree, Princess Lyrelai said, gesturing toward the glowing structure. It contains the complete history of our people, including the parts we have chosen to forget. She approached the tree and placed her hand against its trunk. Immediately, the entire chamber filled with soft light as thousands of holographic images began to appear. Around them, Marcus found himself looking at scenes from the distant past, watching the history of the Zephyrian people unfold like a living documentary. We were not always as you see us now, Princess Lyrelai began, her telepathic voice soft with ancient sadness. Long ago, my people were much like yours. We had limited psychic abilities, nothing more than basic empathy and emotional connection. We lived in peace, built beautiful cities, created art and music that celebrated life itself. The holograms showed Marcus glimpses of this ancient civilization. Zephyrians working together without the harsh dominance he had witnessed in the arena, families sharing meals, children playing games, lovers walking together through gardens where the plants flourished instead of withering away. Their bioluminescent patterns were gentle and warm, speaking of joy and contentment, rather than power and control. What changed? Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer would not be pleasant. The holographic scenes shifted, showing darker images. Strange ships appearing in the Zephyrian skies, vessels that seemed to be made of living shadow, rather than metal or crystal. As these ships approached the peaceful Zephyrian cities, Marcus could see the people below beginning to collapse, falling to their knees as if something was draining the very life from them. The Devourers, Princess Lyrelai said, and even her telepathic voice seemed to grow cold at the name. They came from the deep spaces between galaxies, ancient beings that feed on psychic energy. They had consumed countless civilizations before. They found us, leaving behind only empty worlds filled with mindless shells. The holograms showed the horror of the Devourer invasion, entire cities falling silent as their populations were drained of their mental essence. The beautiful crystal spires becoming dark and lifeless, the gentle, empathic Zephyrians being harvested like crops by creatures that saw them as nothing, more than food. My people faced extinction, Princess Lyrelai continued. The Devourers were drawn to psychic energy like predators to prey, and our natural empathy made us easy targets. Those who tried to resist using normal means were simply consumed faster. Marcus watched as the holographic history showed the desperate, final years of the invasion. Small groups of Zephyrians hiding in deep caves trying to find some way to survive against an enemy that could track them by their very thoughts. Then our scientists made a terrible discovery, Princess Lyrelei said. The only way to survive the Devourers was to become something they could not easily consume. We had to transform ourselves into beings of such overwhelming psychic power that we became predators rather than prey. The next series of images showed Zephyrian scientists working frantically in hidden laboratories. They were experimenting on themselves using advanced genetic manipulation and psychic amplification techniques to artificially evolve their species. Marcus watched in fascination and horror as the gentle, empathic beings began to transform into the powerful telepathic dominators he had met. The process worked, Princess Lyrelei said quietly. We became so psychically powerful that the Devourers could no longer feed on us easily. Our mental defenses were too strong, our psychic presence too overwhelming. We drove them away from our world and claimed victory over extinction. The hologram showed the aftermath of this victory. The Devourers retreating into deep space and the surviving Zephyrians emerging from their hiding places. But they were no longer the same species. Their bioluminescent patterns had become harsh and commanding. Their natural empathy had been replaced by an instinct to dominate. Where once they had worked together as equals, now there was only hierarchy and submission. But the cost was higher than anyone imagined, Princess Lyrelei continued, her mental voice heavy with regret. In saving our lives, we lost our souls. The psychic modifications that protected us from the Devourers also made it impossible for us to connect with other beings as equals. Every relationship became a matter of dominance and submission. Love, friendship, trust, all the things that made life worth living became impossible. Marcus studied the holographic displays showing modern Zephyrian society. He could see the isolation that every individual experienced, the way their overwhelming psychic presence prevented genuine connection with others. Even family relationships were twisted by the constant pressure of mental dominance. For 3,000 years we have lived this way, Princess Lyrelei said. We became the most feared species in the galaxy, but also the most alone. Every interaction is a battle for psychic supremacy. Every conversation is filtered through overwhelming mental pressure. We have power beyond imagination, but we have forgotten what it means to simply talk to another being as an equal. She turned to face Marcus, her bioluminescent patterns showing colors he was beginning to recognize as hope mixed with desperate longing. Until I met you, she said. For the first time in 3 millennia, I was able to have a conversation where the other person was not cowering in terror or plotting against me. You see me as an individual rather than a force of nature. You ask if I am tired when I push my abilities too hard. You notice the beauty in my bioluminescent displays rather than just fearing their power. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had learned. The holographic images continued to play around them, showing the long history of Zephyrian isolation and the price they had paid for survival. Your people made an impossible choice, he said finally. You chose survival over connection, and now you're trapped in a world where you can never truly reach out to another being. Yes, Princess Lyrelei agreed. And that is why humanity is so important. You are the first species we have encountered that is completely immune to our psychic dominance. With you, we might be able to remember what we lost. We might be able to learn how to connect again, how to have relationships based on mutual respect rather than mental superiority. Suddenly, alarms began to sound throughout the palace. The crystal walls of the archive chamber began to pulse with urgent red light. Princess Lyrelei immediately extended her psychic senses, reaching out to understand what was happening. When she spoke again, her mental voice was filled with terror that Marcus had never heard from her before. They have returned, she said, her bioluminescent patterns flashing with patterns that spoke of ancient nightmares coming to life. The Devourers. Our long-range sensors detect their ships approaching the outer edge of our solar system. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. After 3,000 years? Why now? Princess Lyrelei's expression was grim as she began to understand the implications. Prince Vexithar's challenge in the arena was broadcast across the empire. Every species in our territory saw what happened. They saw that humans are immune to our psychic power. She paused, her patterns shifting to colors that spoke of dawning horror. The Devourers feed on psychic energy, but they also feed on fear and suffering. If they learned that there is a species that cannot be controlled by psychic dominance, they would see humans as the perfect weapon against us. They have come to claim your people before we can use your immunity to break free from the prison we created for ourselves. The alarms continued to sound as Marcus realized that humanity's first contact with galactic civilization had just become infinitely more complicated. Their natural resistance to psychic manipulation had made them valuable allies to the Zephyrians, but it had also made them targets for the ancient enemies who had forced the Zephyrian transformation in the first place. "How long do we have?" Marcus asked. Princess Lyrelai's psychic senses reached out across space, touching the edges of the approaching darkness. "The Devourer fleet will reach Zephyria Prime in 18 hours, she said. "And this time they are not coming just to feed. They are coming to finish what they started 3,000 years ago." The command center of the Zephyrian Defense Fleet was a scene of controlled chaos. Dozens of officers moved between glowing control panels, while holographic displays showed the approaching Devourer fleet in terrifying detail. The enemy ships looked nothing like the elegant crystal vessels of the Zephyrians. Instead, they resembled massive organic growths, pulsing with dark energy and trailing streams of what looked like living shadow. Marcus stood beside Princess Lyrelai as she coordinated the planetary defense. Her bioluminescent patterns were shifting rapidly between command colors and the darker hues that indicated deep concern. Around them, Zephyrian military leaders discussed strategies that all seemed to end with the same conclusion. They were vastly outnumbered. 67 Devourer vessels confirmed, reported Admiral Kethvar, his own light patterns showing barely controlled fear. "Each one is larger than our biggest warships. They are broadcasting the same psychic disruption fields they used during the first invasion." On the main display, Marcus could see the Zephyrian fleet moving to intercept the approaching enemy. The crystal ships were beautiful and advanced, but they looked tiny compared to the massive organic structures bearing down on them. Worse, as the two fleets drew closer, he could see the Zephyrian vessels beginning to slow and drift, their crews affected by whatever psychic weapon the Devourers were using. "It's the same as before," Princess Lyrelai said quietly. "The Devourers paralyze their victims with overwhelming terror before they feed. Even our enhanced psychic defenses are not enough to completely resist their influence." The first engagement began badly for the Zephyrians. Their weapons were effective against the Devourer ships, but their crews were struggling to function under the psychic assault. Marcus watched as several crystal vessels simply stopped firing, their crews apparently overcome by the fear projections from the enemy fleet. "Your Radiance," Admiral Kethvar said urgently. "We must consider evacuation protocols. At this rate, the defense fleet will be overwhelmed within hours." Marcus had been studying the tactical displays, trying to understand the nature of the Devourer attack. These creatures were not just physically powerful, they were psychological predators that fed on the terror they created. But something about their attack pattern seemed familiar to him. "Princess," he said suddenly, "you said the Devourers track their prey by psychic energy, right? That they're drawn to mental activity like predators following a scent?" "Yes," she replied, not taking her attention away from the battle reports. "That is why we had to become so psychically powerful. The stronger our mental presence, the harder it became for them to feed on us." "But what if that's exactly wrong?" Marcus asked, his voice growing more excited as an idea began to form. "What if making yourselves more psychically powerful just made you more visible to them, not less edible?" Princess Lyrelai turned to stare at him, her patterns shifting to colors that indicated she was processing a completely new concept. "Think about it," Marcus continued. "Predators don't usually hunt the strongest prey available. They hunt the prey they can actually catch and consume. If the Devourers fed on your ancestors because they were psychically active, maybe increasing that activity just made you into a bigger target, not a harder one." Around the command center, the Zephyrian officers were listening to this conversation with growing attention. The idea that their entire defensive strategy for 3 millennia might be fundamentally flawed was both terrifying and potentially revolutionary. Are you suggesting that humans with no psychic abilities at all would be invisible to the Devourers? Admiral Kethvar asked. More than invisible, Marcus said, pulling up the sensor readings from the approaching enemy fleet. Look at their search patterns. They're scanning for psychic energy signatures just like Princess Lyrelai said, but they're not detecting any of the human crew members aboard your ships. To them, we might as well not exist. Princess Lyrelai's bioluminescent patterns began to shift toward colors that Marcus was learning to associate with desperate hope. If that is true, then humans could move through the Devourer fleet undetected. But what could you possibly do against creatures that have consumed entire civilizations? Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying the displays and thinking about everything he had learned about both species. The Zephyrians had survived by becoming stronger, more dominant, more isolated. But humans had survived by becoming more connected, more empathetic, more cooperative. I need to get aboard one of their ships, he said finally. The entire command center fell silent. Even the background humming of the equipment seemed to quiet as every Zephyrian present processed what the human had just suggested. That is suicide, Admiral Kethvar said bluntly. Even if you could somehow reach their vessels undetected, you would be one human against creatures that have existed since before our civilization began. Maybe, Marcus admitted, but I need to understand what they really are. You said they consume psychic energy and feed on fear and suffering, but what if they're not evil? What if they're just hungry? Princess Lyrelai moved closer to him, her patterns showing deep concern mixed with admiration for his courage. Even if your theory is correct, how could knowing their nature help us defeat them? I don't want to defeat them, Marcus said quietly. I want to help them. The shocked silence that followed was broken only by incoming damage reports from the fleet engagement. 3 more Zephyrian vessels had been disabled by the psychic attacks, and the Devourer ships were continuing their steady advance toward the planet. Captain Chen, Princess Lyrelai said formally, I cannot order you to undertake such a mission. The risk is too great. You're not ordering me, Marcus replied. I'm volunteering, and I think I know how to get close enough to try. An hour later, Marcus was aboard a small Zephyrian scout ship, but he was not alone. Princess Lyrelai had insisted on accompanying him, despite his arguments that her psychic presence would make them visible to the Devourers. I have been hiding from my true nature for 3,000 years, she had told him. If there is a chance to break the cycle of isolation my people have been trapped in, I will take that risk. As they approached the Devourer fleet, Marcus watched the sensor displays with fascination rather than fear. The enemy ships were even more alien up close, their organic surfaces pulsing with patterns that reminded him of deep-sea creatures from Earth. But there was something else, something in the way they moved that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than mere predatory hunger. I'm detecting massive psychic emanations from the lead vessel, Princess Lyrelai reported. The mental pressure is unlike anything in our records. Can you communicate with them? Marcus asked. I could try, but any psychic contact would reveal our location immediately. Marcus thought about this for a moment, then made a decision that surprised even himself. Do it. Let them know we're here. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The nearest Devourer ship turned toward them, and Marcus felt something he had never experienced before. It was not quite telepathic communication, since humans were immune to such things, but it was definitely some form of contact. Images and emotions flooded his mind, not forcing their way in but somehow finding pathways that psychic resistance could not block. What he experienced changed everything he thought he understood about the conflict. The Devourers were not evil predators consuming civilizations for sport. They were refugees, beings whose own galaxy had been destroyed by some cosmic catastrophe. Eons ago, they fed on psychic energy not by choice but by necessity. Their bodies evolved to survive in the empty spaces between stars where no other form of sustenance existed. But more than that, Marcus realized they were in constant, unbearable pain. Consuming the mental energy of other beings sustained their bodies, but poisoned their minds with the thoughts and emotions of their victims. Every devourer carried within itself the memories and suffering of countless consumed civilizations, trapped in an eternal nightmare of borrowed experiences. They're not monsters, Marcus said aloud, his voice filled with wonder and compassion. They're victims. They've been forced to become something they never wanted to be, just like your people were. Princess Lyrelei stared at him in amazement. How do you know this? Because they told me, Marcus replied. Not in words, but in something deeper. They can't communicate with psychic species without overwhelming them, but humans can actually listen to what they're trying to say. The revelation that followed was as profound as it was simple. The Devourers had been trying to communicate with other species for millennia, but their own psychic presence was too overwhelming for most beings to survive contact with them. They had been forced into the role of predators not by choice, but by the tragic inability of other species to understand their true nature. Over the next several hours, with Princess Lyrelei serving as a bridge between Marcus and the Devourer consciousness, a new understanding began to emerge. The ancient enemies were not seeking to destroy civilization, but to find a way to end their own suffering. They had heard about humanity's psychic immunity, and had come not to conquer but to find the first species that might be able to communicate with them without being consumed in the process. The solution that emerged was as elegant as it was in a